Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Southern Reads podcast, the show where I talk about books and only books and everything book related. And today I have a very special guest with me. I have Miss Ginny Myers Sain with me. You may know her as the author of Dark and Shallow Lies, Secrets So Deep, One Last Breath, as well as When the Bones Sing. Her debut novel, Dark and Shallow Lies, was a New York Times bestseller, an indie bookstore bestseller, and Barnes& and Noble Pick of the Month, as well as Amazon's editor's pick. And Crystal Kite was an award winner from the Society of Children's Books, book writers and illustrators. And her latest book, When the Bones Sing, was a Gold Award winner for the 2026 Florida Book Awards, as well as the Amazon's editor's pick. A 2027 Sequoia book for the state of Oklahoma and being shortlisted by the UK Literacy Association. Now she is coming out with a new book coming out next year titled These Twisted Hearts, and her books are available worldwide in 10 countries and counting. She also has more than 15 years of experience as a freelance editor, writing coach, and mentor to writers of all ages at all stages of their careers. So she's here today. She's going to kind of share with us just a little bit of her writing journey. She's going to talk about some of the books that she has come out with, and we're just going to have a really good conversation. So, Jenny, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come on the podcast today. I'm really looking forward to it. Welcome to Southern Reads.
I am glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So you've had a very successful career. You've had multiple books appear in the on New York Times bestseller list. Been in so many accolades, but share with me kind of just the beginning story about kind of your writing and what kind of influenced you to become an author.
Sure, yeah. I always wrote from the time I was really young, but I never thought about myself as being a writer as a career. I was always drawn to the theater. That was sort of my art form of choice. And I majored in theater in college, and I made a career in the theater as an actress, director, teacher, designer. I did a little bit of everything, but primarily I worked as a director and theater teacher with older kids, like high school kids, who were seriously intent on pursuing careers in the theater, and with college students, theater college students. So I worked always in the theater. That was always kind of what I did. And that's where my heart was. I come from a family of writers, though. My mother's a writer, my father was a poet. My brother became the poet laureate of the state of Oklahoma, where we grew up. So I've got writers in my DNA and in my family. But I always was drawn to the theater. But I always knew I could write. I always liked writing. And then when COVID kind of happened and shut down all the theater that I was doing, of course, because theater was one of the first things to go, when we couldn't gather together, I decided to get serious about a book idea that I had that I'd kind of been rolling around in my head for a while. And I finally had the time to really sit down and commit to getting it finished and polished the way I wanted to. And that became the story that would become Dark and Shallow Lies. So that was sort of the beginning of that process.
Yeah, the Dark and Shallow Lies for me, that was the first book that it got me introduced to you as an author, and I've got to say, I think it was one of the first thrillers I think I had read at the time, or kind of had that horror
Hmm.
aspect to it. I remember when reading the book, I actually had chills at one point because of just the unnerving of the story and everything. So it was the first book and only book that's actually given me chills. I was like, I had to get up and walk around the room because I thought, oh, this is getting real creepy. I was like, but it was such
I love
good
that.
writing. It was wonderful writing. So when you were crafting that book, how did you go about the writing process? Did you kind of do like little bits of writing here and there? Did you do a lot of bulk writing?
Yeah, because I wrote that book, of course, never having published anything, what I was hoping to do was write that book and then get a literary agent, and then get a publishing deal. But I didn't know at the time I was writing if that would ever happen. And I wasn't on any kind of a deadline. So I kind of took my time writing that one. Like I said, I started it during the COVID shutdown, and I wrote a good deal of it during that. But then I kind of put it away for a little while, and I would come back to it every so often. So kind of wrote it in spurts, where I'd get really excited about it, and write pretty hard on it for a couple of weeks and then put it away for a little while because life would get busy and then come back to it. And then once I got it finished, I gave it a good round of, revision work, really worked on editing it and polishing it and tightening it. So it took me about a year to write that story, but not a solid year. It was a year of kind of stop and go, and I think that's pretty common for writers. I know you kind of get those periods where you're really inspired and you're working on the book and it's clicking along, and then you hit kind of a hard spot, and we kind of put it away for a little while. So that's kind of the process with that one. Since then, all the other books that I've written have been sold before they're written. So I've been on a deadline with my editor at Penguin, so I've had to work, much in a much more sort of condensed way on those. But that first one, since I didn't have anybody waiting for it, I kind of got to take my time with it.
So once the book kind of got released, I think a lot of authors, one of their big dreams is to be featured on all these lists and like, get all these accolades. What was kind of the after you had released the book, what was kind of the plans and what was kind of life like for you after you had published the book? Did they do a lot of promotion for it? Did you do any kind of book tours for it, or did you just release it and try to let people try to find it on their own?
Well, because it's published with Penguin Random House, Penguin Random House is the biggest publisher in the world. And it was a pretty big top of the list book for Penguin Random House when it was published. So I did get a lot of marketing help and push from Penguin, the Penguin marketing team. I had a wonderful marketing team behind me at Penguin. My agent and my agency did a lot of marketing push for it too, making sure that Penguin was keeping up with things and getting it out there the way that we wanted them to. So there was quite a lot of kind of buzz and push behind that book, which is nice. Um, Not everybody has, the marketing team of a big publisher behind them, but if you do, it can be really helpful, obviously. So that was nice to have Penguin out there promoting the book and posting about the book and sharing about the book and pitching me for book festivals and awards and, all that kind of stuff. So it kind of, immediately I knew that people were interested in the story. It's kind of got an interesting hook to it. It's about a girl in a town full of psychics in the Louisiana Bayou, and people were kind of drawn to the story. So once Penguin started putting it out there, it just kind of snowballed and generated a lot of interest. All of the other wonderful things that happened, hitting the New York Times list, being a Barnes and Noble pick of the month. You can't really anticipate that kind of thing. You can hope for it,
Hmm.
but you just kind of have to hope for the best and see what happens. So those were all like icing on the cake, surprises that I didn't expect certainly, but they were wonderful to have happen.
So after you got kind of the accolades and stuff, did you what was kind of their deal with you? Was it to like write another book or write a series for it, or how did you go about how did they go about wanting to have more books?
When I sold that book, when we sold Dark and Shallow Lies, my agent sold it. We sold it to Penguin Random House. They bought it in a two-book deal, and the deal was for Dark and Shallow Lies and for a second unnamed book, not a sequel, another standalone. So it was never planned to be a series. All of my books, I've got four that are out right now, and another two that are coming in the next couple of years. But they're all standalones. They're not part of a series, and they were never planned to be part of the series. So Penguin gave me a two book contract for that book, and for every subsequent book I've had has been a two-book contract. But what that means is generally they buy the first book and they say we want this book and your next book, whatever that is. And at that point that I sold that book, I didn't have a next book. There was no next book, so I kind of went back to my agent and I was like, "Yeah, this is a two-book contract. They want this book and the next book. I don't have a next book." And he kind of talked me down off the ledge and said, "Oh, you'll have a next book." But that's kind of how that works. So they've been two-book contracts for the book I was pitching and selling, and then for a follow-up that was not related.
And the follow-up that you came out with was Secret So Deep. Now, what's really interesting about this book is you actually had two different covers for the book. Now, when you're going about releasing the books, how do you go about designing the cover of it, how you want the kind of the front of the book to look like?
Oh, well, when you're published with a company like Penguin, you don't go about designing the cover. They have designers that do that for you. So they have a stable of designers that they work with. I did get a lot of say in the cover design process. Not all authors do. Most get some. I had quite a bit of say just because I have a really good agent, like I said, a literary agent who jumped in kind of on my behalf, and make sure that my voice gets heard in those discussions. But when you work with a publisher, a big publisher, you don't design your own covers or anything. So what happens generally is the design team at Penguin will come back to me with three or four possible mock-up directions, that they're thinking about. three or four different ideas. And then my agent and I will look at those and discuss, which ones we like. And we'll get back with my editor and talk about which ones she likes. And we all kind of put our heads together and kind of pick a direction from those mock-ups, that we like best. And then there are usually three or four other kind of refining versions of that we see. So we'll see another version, and maybe it's like, oh, we like this, but the color isn't quite right, or the font isn't quite right, or we need to add something. And that goes on, like I said, three or four rounds of that usually before we get to the final design process. I was really lucky with those first four book covers. They're all beautiful. And I did have the same designer for all of them at Penguin, which was really nice because she really got my stories and knew exactly, what we're trying to do with those designs. So lots of fun to work with that designer. But that's one of the nice things about being traditionally published is you don't really have to worry about, designing your own cover. I'm not a designer by any means, so I was glad to let somebody else handle that.
Yeah, when it came to the podcast artwork for me too, that was kind of the hardest thing that I had trouble with too was design because I don't really have a lot of artistic background.
Me either.
I can barely draw a stick figure at that. So it was like this it was the toughest part for me was to try to come up with a background for it. But I luckily AI kind of helped save me in Photoshop, so I was kind of shocked to have that come in. Um, so when you release the books, do you pay any close attention to the reviews that come for it, or do you primarily stay focused in on like the higher critics more than maybe what the fans of the series or fans of your books say?
Those trade journal reviews, Kirkus, School Library Journal, Publishers Weekly, things like that are super important for trad published books, for traditional published books. Um, those Carcass reviews and Publishers Weekly, especially. And then if you're writing for young people, and mine are technically YA, things like School Library Journal, those are very, very important reviews. So we do pay a lot of attention to those. We kind of wait sort of apprehensively for those to come out. I don't really read a lot of reader reviews unless, I get tagged in something, and it shows up that way. But in general, the sort of advice is not to go like digging, looking for those reviews. At that point, the book is published, so those reviews aren't going to be super helpful anyway. But I do look at reader reviews. Like if a lot of people are very kind, and readers will tag me in great reviews all the time, and then I can share them and that sort of thing. But as far as like looking for them, my agent sends me those big, trade journal reviews, like I said, Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, all that. And the rest, like the reader reviews, if I happen to stumble across one or someone sends me one, then I'll see them, but not really otherwise.
Now, I know in the books that you kind of balance a lot of how for young adult, there's a lot of different aspects and ways of trying to get different themes in there. How do you try to infiltrate popular themes that a lot of young adults may go through, but without trying to make that be the full focus point of the story?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the first advice I give to anyone who wants to write for teens or for kids, young people of any age, really, is that primarily your first job is to tell a good story. Um, and I don't seek out to teach a lesson or to impart wisdom, or to give the youth the wisdom of my years or anything like that. Kids smell that a mile away, and nobody wants that. What they want is a good story. So that's what I try to do, is write a good story. Now I do think that good stories inherently have lessons in them. We learn things from good stories. We pick up themes and messages and important ideas. But I think if you set out to teach a lesson or to share wisdom or whatever, then you're doomed pretty much as a writer. Your job is to tell a really good story, and good stories teach us things.
One of the latest book, When the Bones Sing, is kind of the latest book that you have come out with. How do you get inspirations for all your stories, and are they from some personal experience or from people that you know that have dealt with it? How do you come out with these storylines?
Well, I write murder mysteries, so thankfully they're not usually from personal experience, at least the main part of the plot. But I always tell people I haven't buried anyone, in the woods or anything like that. But for me, my books are very dependent on setting, so the places they take place are very important. And for me, that's where a lot of the inspiration comes from. I lived for a long time in the Arkansas Ozarks, which is where When the Bones Sing is set. And when I lived in the Ozarks, I really fell in love with the folklore and the folk history and the folk medicine and just the tapestry of like story that was so woven into those hills. And I knew that I wanted to tell a story that took place in the Ozark Mountains and that kind of wrapped up all of that, the folk medicine, the folk tales, the legends. There's a cryptid in there called the Ozark Howler, who's part of sort of the local tapestry of culture. So I really wanted to put all that in there. So a lot of times the inspirations for my stories actually come from the places they're set, the people that live there, the stories that they tell, the history that they have.
When you release the books, how long does it normally take for you to receive feedback about, if it's going to be like a New York bestseller? How long does that process usually take?
Yeah, like to find out about that kind of stuff, it just kind of depends, it can take it can be instant, it can take a long time. You like I said, honestly, you get a lot of feedback before the story is released. Those trade reviews, like I said, are super important. The Kirkus reviews, the Publishers Weekly reviews, the School Library Journal reviews, those like official trade journal reviews come out before publication. So you already have a pretty good idea what to expect. My trade reviews have always been really positive, which has been really great. So you go into that. I've always gone into that launch date knowing at least that those big important trade reviews are positive, that Penguin's getting the word out there, that people are going to find out about it. All the other stuff, the lists, the awards, all of that, they just kind of happen as they happen. Sometimes it can be right off the bat, sometimes it takes a while to get steam going. Like for instance, just this week, When the Bones Sing, which released in March of 2025, so it's been a little over a year since that book came out. Just this week, it is shortlisted for the UK Literary Association Award, which is the top literary award for children's literature in the United Kingdom. Well, that I didn't find that out until about a year after the book came out. So sometimes, sometimes it takes a while for those things, and sometimes there's overlap. Like a book that releases in late 2025 will actually be up for awards during the 2026 season. So sometimes it just depends on the timing of the book and the timing of the release and all of that stuff.
Do you do any traveling for books for promotion, or does Penguin Random House do a pretty decent job of promoting it to where you don't have to do kind of a book tour to help promote the book?
Yeah, I mean, both of those. Penguin does a really good job of promoting it, but I also do a lot of traveling. Partly because it is good promotion, but partly just because I enjoy it. I love getting out and meeting readers and being at book festivals and being with other writers and visiting bookstores. I mean, that's part of the fun of it for me. And I come from the world of the theater. I'm kind of an extroverted person anyway. I always love to talk to people. So getting out and talking to readers and talking to the writers is a great part of the fun. I do a lot of book festivals at different places. I do a lot of bookstore visits. I think I did like 74 bookstore visits in 2025. So I try to get out there as often as I can. Sometimes Penguin schedules those kinds of things. Sometimes festivals or bookstores will contact me directly. It just kind of depends, how people get in touch in various ways. But I'm always glad to get out there and talk to readers and meet writers.
Yeah, Forbes magazine for 2025, they listed a thing called the 40 most anticipated young adult books of 2025, and When the Bone Sing was actually ranked at number two. You know, have all these books get such high praise, and to be selected among other authors in the same category. How does it feel having your work be recognized at this level of success?
I mean, that's always a thrill. Anytime you get recognized in any way, writers, what we do a lot of the times we kind of do, on our own in our house, kind of huddled over a keyboard, and we never know what's going to happen to the words that we put on the page. We're not quite sure what the reaction is going to be when we send them out into the world. So anytime you send a story out there and the reaction is positive, and readers like it and other writers like it and trade journals and reviewers like it. I mean, that's a sigh of relief, obviously. That's a great thing. That particular feature in Forbes being the second most anticipated YA book was a big thrill because it was right beneath the newest of the Hunger Games releases, so obviously that was great. You love seeing that kind of thing in print. I will say that like all those things kind of add up. They add up to, making you feel good about a story, or making a story kind of get some splashy buzz. But it is really the readers that matter. It's really the readers that you're trying to reach. So the best thing for me is still having readers come up to me, like at bookstore events or at book festivals, and tell me, "Oh, I love this book, and here's why." That's much more interesting and important for me as a writer.
Does it get a little too overwhelming knowing that all these books get such high praise and get so much buzz around the internet, around different lists? Do you have to have any kind of pressure when writing the next book for for it to kind of reach that same success?
Oh, of course, yeah, and I think that's true for all writers. There's kind of an acknowledgement in the writing world that writing the second book is the hardest book you'll ever write, and that's particularly true if your first book does really well. There is a lot of pressure there. Most of it, I think, is pressure we put on ourselves. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves as writers to reach a certain level, and particularly if other things we've written have done really well. But of course, there's also pressure from the industry, from publishers and agents and marketers and all of that kind of stuff. Like you want your work to do well and you want it to be recognized. So we always put pressure on ourselves. Coming from the world of the theater, where I started, like I said, my career, I was kind of used to working in an art form where you're constantly putting yourself out there for judgment, or going into an audition, or putting a production on, or being on stage. You get very used to sort of putting yourself out there for reviews and for other people's thoughts and for other people's opinions. So I was a little bit used to that going in, but there's always a certain amount of pressure in that for sure.
Knowing what is the hardest part of being like a very popular young adult novelist? Is it the writing? Is it the story details? What for you personally is the hardest thing?
Well, the hardest part of the writing process for me is drafting, like a first draft. For me, drafting is hard work, getting the story out the first time. When I go back to revise or to edit it, I like that process. That's when I really make it shine, make it work. And I love revision and editing. That's fun for me. Drafting is not fun for me. I always tell people the difference is like drafting is like building a house. It's putting up the walls, putting the roof on, making sure the floor is even. Like that's just hard work. But revision and editing is like decorating the house. It's like picking out the pillows and the countertops and the art for the walls and the color, paint for the bedrooms. Like that's fun. So I like revision and editing. I don't love drafting, but unfortunately, you have to draft a book before you can edit it. So I keep having to do it. Other than that, the hardest part is just kind of making sure that you always have something else in the pipeline. Like when I'm finishing one book, that I've got another book idea that's coming up. Because you got to always have the next thing. So being always thinking ahead while still having your head kind of in the book you're working on at the moment, while thinking ahead to the next project, that can get tricky sometimes.
Now, outside of writing, you actually also do a lot of speaking engagements and specifically with schools and libraries, talking to writers groups and you talking to a lot of young students that are wanting to go into writing. What kind of inspired you to take time out of your schedule to go to schools and libraries to talk to future writers?
Well, like I said, I started, my career working with young people in the theater, working with high school students, working with college students. And I love that age group. I love working with teenagers in the theater. And then that sort of translated over to the work I was doing in writing. I'm always so impressed by the passion of young artists, whether that's in the theater or young writers or young musicians or anyone across the board. But anyone, those young people who are passionate about their art, whatever that is, their loyalty to each other and their passion to what they're doing is just such an inspiring thing to be around. So I always loved working with kids that age in the theater, and I just kind of carried that into the work I was doing as a writer. So it seemed like a natural fit to reach out to those same age groups, particularly since those are the groups the book is aimed at. I would say, I mean, at least half of my readers are adults. But I do have, obviously they're technically young adult books, so I do have a huge young adult readership. So going out and meeting those readers in the places they are, which are their schools or their libraries or whatever, seemed like a natural fit for what I was doing.
What's been a huge inspiration or someone that you've gone to these writer conferences and What's been a story that they've told you that has really stood with you all these years?
When you go to those writers' conferences, and I started going, when I started seriously thinking about writing, you kind of wait all the time to hear like the big thing that's going to make sense to you. Like, this is the big thing that's going to change everything for me. This is the one big piece of information that I've been waiting for. And for a while, I got kind of disappointed because I never got that one big thing. I'm like, what is the one big thing that's going to make this work? But after a while, what I figured out was the thing about those conferences, about writers' conferences especially, is it's more about the connection with the other writers. It's more about being in a room full of people who are all working toward the same goal. There's such energy in that, and such community, and such support, and such encouragement, that a lot of times I would come home from those conferences. And what I took from it wouldn't even be something that I heard on stage, not something a speaker said or something that someone left us with, but it would be something, it would be more just a sense of renewed energy and renewed focus and renewed inspiration. And that's why I think writers' conferences are such a great thing if you're able to do them as a writer. You do learn so much, of course, from the workshops and from the speakers, technical information about your craft, about the business of publishing, and that's also important. But it's for me, it was always mostly about that sense of community and energy and support, and just coming back renewed, like, okay, I can do this. I can sit down and have the inspiration to work on this story, or feel good about what I'm working on. I think one of the best things, that you hear over and over again from writers is that you have to just sit down and do the work. And unfortunately, that's the hardest part. Whether you would go to hear a talk from a 10-time New York Times bestseller, or from someone who was just getting started, that advice was always kind of across the board. You can't be a writer if you don't sit down and write. And at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to.
For you personally, do you have there been times when writing the books kind of becomes a little too over the top to where you've had moments of kind of wanting to step back and take a break from it?
I mean, the over the top as far as like, this deadline is really tight, or I'm having to work really hard to get this chapter to work, or that sort of thing. I mean, sometimes the crunch of like having a deadline to meet can be kind of daunting, especially when things aren't working quite right. But as far as like emotionally overwhelming or whatever, not really for me. Not at this point yet. I've certainly had times where I wish I had more time, or I wish I wasn't so pressed for a deadline, or something wasn't looming kind of over my head so large. But you kind of learn how to work under those circumstances. And most of us, I think, as people, but as artists as well, kind of do our best work under pressure sometimes. So sometimes those deadlines are actually helpful, in forcing you to sit down and get the work done that you might put off otherwise. So that hasn't happened yet for me. I mean, I know that it can happen for a lot of people. I know a lot of writers kind of get burnt out, and need a break. And who knows, I may get there eventually. But so far, it's working pretty well.
So we kind of go into now talking about your latest book or book that will be coming out early next year called These Twisted Hearts. And
Mhm.
the thing about this one that has kind of stood out to me is it's kind of a different standpoint of kind of theme, and there's also kind of another thing. So tell me a little bit about what These Twisted Hearts is about.
Yeah, so this book comes out in very early 2027. And like my other books, it's a dark, twisty thriller mystery with some paranormal and some romance in it. This particular book is set in Oklahoma, which is where I grew up and raised and lived till I went to college. So it's set in Oklahoma. It's about a girl who is a storm chaser in a small town in Oklahoma. And this is a town in Oklahoma that has been destroyed by tornadoes by an unusually big number of times. Tornadoes keep trying to wipe the town off the map, and the plot of the story revolves around her and a stranger who comes to town, and their investigation as to why these tornadoes are plaguing this tiny Oklahoma town. And there's of course like a supernatural connection to it. Like I said, there's a lot of romance in it, so it's a really fun story to tell.
Where did you get your inspiration from when it came to writing and kind of crafting this book?
Well, like I said, a lot of times my inspiration comes from that setting. I had not written an Oklahoma book, although I did grow up in Oklahoma. I'm an Oklahoman by birth, and lived there, for a huge chunk of my life. So I knew that eventually I would tell an Oklahoma story. And I knew that it would probably be a tornado story because we have a lot of tornadoes in Oklahoma. But also because some of my, my memories of growing up there are storm watching. My dad was both terrified and fascinated by storms. So, when you're a Oklahoma kid, you grow up sort of watching the weather the way kids in other states watch football games. You would kind of sit there at night and watch the meteorologist. And I knew that that was the story I wanted to tell, but it took me a little while to figure out exactly what the plot would be as far as the mystery and the supernatural connection and all of that. But my inspiration from it really just came from those years growing up in that state and looking at those wide open skies and the stormy skies and watching the weather.
When you were writing that book, what was kind of your favorite part about writing this book compared to the others that you have had come
Um,
out?
yeah, people ask me a lot, like, what's your favorite book that you've written? And I always tell them it's hard to figure out. It's like asking someone what your favorite kid is. I only have one kid, so I can usually answer that question. But it's harder with books because there are favorite things about all of them, things that I like best about different books. About with this book, I particularly loved writing those descriptions of that Oklahoma landscape and that farm where Jubilee, who's the main character, lives. I think a lot of people who haven't been there kind of picture what they think Oklahoma looks like. And they think, well, that's not a very pretty place. But there's a certain kind of stark beauty in those wide open landscapes and those big skies and those plains, that kind of go on forever. And to be able to kind of capture the starkness of that and kind of the loneliness of that setting, but also the sort of strange beauty of that setting was a lot of fun on paper.
Over all your books that you've have released and will release, who have been some huge inspirations author wise that have helped really inspired your writing and helped inspired you to
Yeah,
become a very successful writer?
that's a good question. When I started, I've always been a big reader and I've always loved mysteries and I love spooky things. My favorite book, probably of all time, is Rebecca. And I read Rebecca when I was in, gosh, probably sixth or seventh grade. And I've read it maybe 10 times probably since then. And those kind of gothic novels like that, with the lonely manor house on the sweeping, the plains of the moors and the clouds overhead, and sort of the broodingness of those settings. That's something that I comes into a lot of the stories that I write. So I point back toward Rebecca as kind of being like a keystone of my literary education and something that shows up again and again and again in the things that I write in various ways. The romance of that, and the darkness and the mystery. Those things are always there. I also books like The Haunting of Hill House show up a lot, in my writing. I read so much of that kind of thing when I was in junior high and high school, and I think that's the things you read at that particular age, sixth grade to 12th grade or so. They kind of seep into your imagination in a way that books you read later really don't. Um, so reading so many of those gothic stories and gothic mysteries as a young reader, I think really impacted me. There are writers, whose work I love now. Erica Waters is someone that I mention a lot. She's got several great books that are very atmospheric. They're also YA thrillers. I read a lot of her stuff before I started writing. And hers was kind of the first stuff that I read that was like, this is the kind of stuff I want to write. Like I see now kind of what I want to be as far as a storyteller. So I always point out her stuff's great. Um, there are lots of other writers, mystery writers, that I read and enjoy. But those are probably the things that I would mention as the major keystones.
If you could go back and, look back over your life, what are you the most proud of?
Oh gosh. Well, it depends on kind of what you're in what realm. Obviously I have a son who's a wonderful human being. So he's the thing I would point to first always. He's just a good guy and I'm super, super proud of who he's become. So as a person, he's my number one accomplishment. As an artist, Lots of things. I have a group of theater students that I'm very, very proud of that I worked with during their high school and college years, and they're off doing amazing things in the theater. So I would say that they're sort of the thing I point to second. Like I'm so proud of those kids and what they're doing. And of course, all of the work that I've done as a writer, I'm super proud of all of that. I don't, although I'm super excited and always pleased to say, oh, I'm a New York Times bestseller, or this book won this award, or it's gotten this accolade. What I'm most proud of is the fact that there are people out there who come up to me all the time and say, "Oh my gosh, I loved this book," or "This is my favorite book." I love one of the things that makes me most happy is when people come to book signings to see me. And they bring me their book to sign, and it's full of like little tabs and notes and sticky notes and things, passages they've underlined. That's really exciting to see, because that book has been really loved and really thought about and really like considered and pondered and analyzed, and that's always fun.
One of the things that I really love about your writing is that you're not really afraid to go to certain limits. There's not really a limit that you can go when it comes to sharing the story and really diving into like sharing what your characters are experiencing and whatnot. What I really liked about Dark and Shallow Lies is kind of what I said earlier was the creepiness of it. I never have had a book that's actually given me like uncomfortable kind of like something's wrong here. It was just
Right.
I had never read something like that, and that was just like shows you how well the writing was and how well you really crafted. Um, which book do you personally think people resonate with the most?
Oh gosh, I don't think there is particularly one. I could look back over the messages I get, and they're pretty equally distributed among all four of the books that I have out so far. It just kind of depends on which one resonates with people. I always laugh because people will say on Instagram, "Oh, I might see 10, 15 posts a day where someone has said, 'Oh my gosh, this is my favorite Ginny Myers Sain books,' and they're always different. They're never, the same one. So it just depends on what people are drawn to. A lot of people love that bayou kind of vibe in Dark and Shallow Lies, and the sense of unease in that book. And I love that you mentioned that, because that's exactly what I wanted, was that sense of just something being off, just uneasy and not right. The tension in that people love. A lot of people love Secrets So Deep because it's set on the coast of Connecticut in a haunted theater there. So it's like seaside, foggy lighthouse vibes. A lot of people love that setting. It's also Secret So Deep is probably also the most deeply romantic of the books that I've got out right now. Not necessarily from a romance, like meaning love story standpoint, but like from the more literary, like romantic genre overall. So people love that one. A lot of people love One Last Breath, which is my third book. It's set in the Florida Springs. It's about a girl who's a free diver, and it's a cold case mystery in a small Florida town. A lot of people love that kind of story particularly. So I really get a lot of notes on that one. And then When the Bones Sing, people love that folk magic and the folklore in that one, and they're really drawn to that setting. I get a lot of messages that say, "Oh, I didn't know anything about the Ozark Mountains. I've never been to Arkansas. Thanks for giving me a picture of what this place looks like or what this feels like." So I think it just depends. I don't think there doesn't really seem to be one in particular that most people are drawn to, which I think is great. When I pitch those books, like when I go to a book festival or a book signing at a bookstore, people always say, "Tell me about the books," and I give a one or two sentence little blurb about each one, and it's always interesting to see which one then they reach for, because there's always something in one of them that speaks to someone or calls to somebody.
Well, I wanted to kind of play a little game with you called All
Okay.
About Jenny. So this is all questions that I have for you that are kind of what you personally would want to do. So first question I'll have is if you could take one of your stories international and have a story be focused internationally, where would your first place be?
Oh, you mean like if I could write a story in an international setting? Is that what you mean? Oh
Yes.
gosh, that's a good question. My sister spent some time living on the island of Malta, which is a strange place, sort of it's not quite Italy, but it's not quite anywhere else. It's its own little country, and it's a tiny little island nation. And it was such an interesting, fascinating, like just sort of strange place apart from anywhere else. And that might be a really fun place to set an international story. It's not a place a lot of people have a lot of knowledge of, so it'd be kind of new to people. And it is just kind of this place that seems separate from the rest of the world. So that might be a really fun place to set it.
What is one book ick that kind of drives you up the wall?
Oh gosh. I don't really have one particular thing that drives me up the wall. I will admit that I'm not a series reader. I prefer standalones. So I don't really read a lot of series, which is part of the reason probably that I don't write series. I prefer to write standalones as well, just from a reading standpoint. Kind of by the time I get through with a book, I'm sort of done with those characters and ready for them to move on and out of my life. So I don't necessarily want to read 3 or 4 other books about the same character. So well, it's not really an ick. I guess it's just more of a preference that I don't really love series. That's what I would say probably.
If you could have one book kind of be like a recommendation to another book from a really popular author, what book would you recommend to people about?
Do you mean if I could recommend a book by someone else? Is that what you're talking about, or?
Mhm.
Yeah, there are lots of great books that I would recommend. There's a particular book called The Honeys, which is by an author called his name is Ryan LaSala. We have the same agent, so I kind of knew a little bit about him before that book came out. But if you're looking for like really fun, unusual horror, Ryan LaSala writes really cool stuff. He's got a new one I think coming out that's like ocean themed or mermaid, like evil mermaids or something like that. But his stuff is really fun. It's very horror adjacent, but it's always different and fresh and unusual. So that's someone that I always love to recommend.
From all the characters that you have wrote about and created, which character do you think you relate to the most?
Oh goodness. You know, there's always a certain amount of me sort of in those protagonist main characters, and I think that's kind of true for most writers. We sort of put ourselves in that main character a little bit. There are lots of things about my main characters that are not me, and of course the main characters are all different, but they all have a little bit of me in them somewhere. Um, there's not really one that I particularly relate to. Like I said, they're all different. There are characters. Most of my favorite characters in those stories tend to be either supporting characters or side characters. Those are kind of the ones that I tend to fall in love with, even though they don't necessarily have a lot of me in them. There's something about those characters that draws me to that character. The character of Hart in Dark and Shallow Lies is a secondary character, a very important character, but he's not the protagonist. He's not the point of view character. But he was the character that came to me first in that story. And although he's nothing like me, I felt like I knew him right off. I was like, oh, I know this guy. Like there's something about him that feels familiar to me. So while there's always a lot of me in the main characters, it's generally those side characters that kind of win my heart.
If you could take any of your books and have them be created as either a live action series or a full-length film, which book do you think would be the best?
Oh gosh. That's a good question. Um, I think they'd all do really well for different reasons. I'd love to see Dark and Shallow Lies. I think is a like a Netflix series. We have those conversations all the time. My agent and I are my film and TV agent. So hopefully maybe that'll come to you eventually. But I think that would be a lot of fun because of the different psychic abilities. I just think there's lots of different paths they could go down for different storylines, and there's lots of opportunity to expand that particular storyline in different directions with the different characters. There are 10 kids in there, the summer children who are kind of the core group of kids, which gives you a lot of like options for um, you know, taking that story in different directions or seeing it through different eyes.
If you could take any book from any genre that's been released, and this can be like a old modern classic or a modern classic, or there's a really popular book on social media. If you could take one book and remove the original author's name and you could put your name on it, what book do you wish that you had written yourself?
That's a really good question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. You know, hmm. I can't think of a particular book, like like a single book. But I'd love to have written something that's super popular. Something that gets made into a blockbuster movie eventually would be lovely. Anything that's gone viral on Book Talk, I will take any of those. Some really popular series would be great. But I don't know if I have a particular book, like one specific one.
And one last question for the game. If you could, if you were transported into any of these book settings and had to face whatever your characters had gone through, which book setting would you feel like you would be able to survive the most?
Oh gosh, that's another good question. You're good at this. Um, hmm. Well, I don't really like snakes or mud. So I don't necessarily want to be traipsing through the bayou if I can help it. Um, Secrets So Deep is set in a theater on the Connecticut coast. I feel pretty comfortable in the theater. I might be able to do pretty well there. Um, when the Bone Sing is set in Arkansas, which is a place I know, but I don't necessarily want to do a lot of like serious hiking up in those mountains. That sounds pretty rough too. So I think I'd have to go with a theater setting. I could probably handle that one.
Well, to kind of wrap things up here a little bit, one last question I'll kind of end on is, you know, if anyone's listening, if they are wanting to be a writer like yourself and would like to become a very successful writer and author, what advice do you have for them of how they can become a really successful writer, what in whatever genre that they choose to really pursue?
Yeah, I mean the two pieces of advice that you get all the time. Unfortunately, the first thing you need to know is there are no real shortcuts to that. There's no magic pill, unfortunately, or no like one, revelation that will lead you down that path. The two ways to do it are to read as much as you can, particularly in the genre that you want to write in. I work with writers all the time, and I can't tell you how often people will say, "Oh, I want to write a mystery or I want to write a romance." And then I say, well, do you read many mysteries or do you read many romances? And they say, oh, no, not really. It's really hard to write something successfully if you don't read a lot of it. So that's number one, read as much as you can. And then number two, write as much as you can and improve your craft by going to writers' conferences, taking writers' workshops, working with critique groups and peer readers and things like that. The time you put in sort of improving your craft and focusing on your craft is important. Unfortunately, there aren't any shortcuts, but doing those two things helps get you down the road for sure.
Well, I think those are really is really great advice. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come on the podcast today to share your story and to really share your work with my audience. I think what you've been able to craft and been able to achieve is is really inspirational, and I think a lot of people are going to find a lot of benefits in it. For people that would love to check out your books and they would
Mhm.
love to follow you and support you on your journey to see what you come out with next, where can they go to learn more information and more importantly, where can they go to follow you?
Sure, you can follow me. I'm on all the social media, Ginny Myers Sain, just like it is on the front of my books. I'm most active on Instagram, so that's like where you'll find me most. But I am other places as well. If you're looking to get books, you can get those anywhere books are sold. Your local brick and mortar bookstores, independent bookstores are great places to walk in. If they don't happen to have one of my books that are looking for, they're always really good about ordering that. So go to your local bookstore. Barnes and Noble, of course, has the books. Amazon has the books. All pretty much any place you can get books. They're all available, I will say, on Kindle as well. And there are really incredible. Penguin has done a really great job with the audiobooks of all four of them. So if you're an audiobook listener, highly recommend you check out the audiobooks. Across the board, they're all great audiobooks as well.
And I will put all of her links into the description box below. Her website, socials will be down there. I'll try to include some books links as well to her, where you can get them. If you're listening to the podcast on Spotify, I know that you can actually tag some audiobooks in there. So I'll kind of link those in there as like additional things so that you
That
can
sounds
find
good.
see those and that you can go directly to them. Um I will put all that information in the show notes and down below, so just look for that. Oh, you're more than welcome to follow me on the socials as well. You can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at southern.reads. Follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at Noah's Podcasts. And feel free to check out my website, noahspodcasts.com, to learn more about this show, as well as the other podcasts that I do. So feel free to check those out. And again, all that will be down below. Thank you so much for everyone for tuning in to today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day. Be safe, and I'll see you in the next episode of Southern Reads.
Thank you very much.